O great and majestic God, Lord of all dominions, land and sea, rivers, tributaries, Lord of our grandfathers and grandmother. Just kidding. In this video, I'm going to share with you how to sound authentic whenever you speak between worship songs. Coming up. Hey there, my name's Spencer from leadingworshipwell.com, your daily dose of practical worship leading tips. If you want to find those tips, head over to Instagram or Facebook at leadingworshipwell, where I'm posting new worship leading tips every single day. But you're here on YouTube, so go ahead, hit the subscribe button down below, and let's get into it, because today we're talking about how to sound authentic whenever you speak while leading worship. And before we get into the tips, if you haven't checked out the complete series that I did on this topic, you can check it out right here. It's called What to Say While Leading Worship, the Ultimate Guide. And in that series, it's like over 2 hours worth of training. I take you through crafting your speaking transitions from the very beginning of your service all the way to the very end. So if you didn't check that out yet and you want to dive deeper into this topic of speaking between worship songs, go check that out. But today we're talking about how to sound authentic when you're actually speaking while you're leading worship. And I don't know if you've noticed before, but a lot of worship leaders kind of get what I call worship leader voice whenever they're speaking while leading worship. And they kind of get in this hushed, whispered tone, and they start using words that they would never use on a regular basis. And I'm looking at them, I'm like, since when do you talk like that? Like, I don't know anybody that talks like that. For some reason, we think that we have to talk a certain way whenever we're up in front of our church leading people. But I want to challenge you today to realize that it's much better to be authentic than to sound like you're some super intelligent person who has a huge vocabulary when really you're just copying what you've heard other people say. Craig Rochelle says it best. He says that people would rather follow a leader who is always real than one who is always right. And so if we could just commit to being real instead of trying to sound right or do what we think that we should, or sound what we think we should be sounding like, then it would serve us so much better, because there would be so much less pressure on us, because we wouldn't be worrying about what to say. We'd just be able to get on stage and be ourselves. And then when we're off stage, we're the same person off stage that we were on stage. So I want to share with you these 5 tips how to sound authentic while speaking to your church. The first way to sound authentic when speaking between worship songs is to recognize that your church needs you to lead them. Your church needs you, being yourself, to lead them. They don't want some bad copy of Chris Tomlin or some bad copy of Paul Baloche or whatever worship leaders you're following and trying to emulate. They don't need that. They need you to be you, because you know your church's context better than anybody else ever could, because you are a part of your church. So whenever you can speak authentically and speak in a way that you would normally speak, because you're part of the community that your church is in, so your community has a culture within it, and the more you can be yourself and speak into that culture, the more people will connect. So there's much more benefit in just being yourself than trying to do what you see all these other worship leaders doing. So recognize that your church needs you to lead them. They don't need somebody else. So allow that to free you up to feel like you can just be yourself whenever you're speaking. And of course, that's kind of hard to do because you have got nerves, and it's different speaking in front of people. So that's what these next few tips are about. They're all about how to actually get to that place of authenticity. Push past the nervousness, push past the uncertainty. So here's tip number 2, and that is to prepare in advance. Like, literally think about what you want to say. I think people think that it's more spiritual to just kind of make up whatever you want to say on the spot. I don't find that that's the case. I think that God is working through us all the time. He can work through us whenever we're sitting alone in our room preparing to lead worship on a Thursday night, the same as he can work through us on a Sunday morning spur of the moment. So whenever you come into your worship leading with a plan, it frees you up to just be yourself, because you're not thinking, oh man, what do I need to say next? You already know what you need to say next, and it can just come out. So what does preparing in advance look like? Well, it looks like you sitting down, figuring out where all of your speaking transitions are going to be. Worship through your set list, figure out where those transition points are going to be, and then take the time to map out what you're going to say. And like I said before, if you haven't checked out that series of what to say while leading worship, or what to say between worship songs, I did a specific video on this. You can check that video out right here, and that'll take you through the complete process of preparing in advance. And then you're going to write down exactly what you're going to say, exactly what you want to say, word for word, because no matter what you do, if you just have it in your head, it's always a scrambled mess. Even if you don't think that it is and you're like, okay, I got this down, there's just power in actually writing down what you're going to say, because it forces you to come up with a concrete plan. I think we kind of cheat ourselves whenever we just think about it in our heads, because we're like, yeah, I kind of got the idea up there, it's okay. But whenever you write it down and you see it on a piece of paper, whatever you want to say, then that helps you to commit to it. And then not only that, but also writing things down helps you remember it better. So tip number 2, prepare in advance. Now that we've prepared in advance, it's time to move on to tip number 3, because I know that if you did that, you wrote down exactly what you want to say, and now you've got basically a script in front of you. But tip number 3 is this: we want to memorize talking points, not a script. We don't want to memorize word for word the paragraph that you wrote out whenever you were planning your speaking transition, because that's not going to sound authentic either. That's going to sound like you're reading from a teleprompter. So instead of speaking from a script, and there's a lot of pressure in that, in memorizing a script, because whenever you get off of that script, you're completely lost. And you're like, oh man, I forgot this specific word right here, and now I messed up, and now I'm completely discombobulated. So instead, what you want to do is memorize your talking points. So now that you've written out your speaking transition word for word, look at it and say, okay, what is the 1 or 2 points that I'm trying to get across here? And that's what you want to memorize. And then put the piece of paper away that you wrote down, or the computer file, or on your phone, or wherever you did it. Put it away. Now you've got those speaking points planned out and memorized, and then just work on connecting those two. And that's how you sound authentic, because whenever we come into a normal conversation, we don't have a script in our head that we're reading off of. We might have a couple ideas that we want to say to people, but most of the time it's honestly just popping in our head, right? And we're going with the flow. You can do the same thing whenever you're speaking while leading worship. Just have those few points that you want to express to your church so that you can lead them well, and then work from there and just go with the flow. And that takes practice. It's not going to happen instantly, but the more you do it, the more authentic you'll sound. Tip number 4, use the same sort of language you would use in everyday life. Use the language that you would normally use in a conversation. If you heard at the beginning of the video, I used some really big words. I was talking about mightiest God, Lord of our grandfathers and grandmothers, tributaries. I don't even know what I was saying, but I don't use that language on a daily basis, so I wouldn't use it in front of my church. And I think too often we think that we have to use language in front of our church that's some, like, I'll call it high language, wherever it has to be super intellectual. But people don't want that. They want authenticity. That's why we're talking about speaking authentically. When you can speak authentically and you're like on the same level as other people, they're like, yeah, I know what this guy's saying. I talk like that, so I understand what they're saying and I can follow along. But if you're using these huge words that you would never use in ordinary, normal, daily life, then people aren't going to be able to follow along. So just use normal language. Think about how you normally talk to people in your church. If you're talking different on stage than you are off stage, then you need to change that, because that puts so much pressure on you to just try to come up with these grandiose words that you have to get out to sound impressive. We aren't trying to impress people. We're trying to lead people. And the best way to lead people is with clarity. So just be clear. Speak to people like you would if you were off stage and just in a small group Bible setting. Finally, tip number 5 is think about what people need to hear and not just what you want to say. Think about what people need to hear and not what you want to say. Because whenever worship leaders come into their time of worship, they've got these things that they want to say. And they're like, well, I heard Elevation say this whenever they were speaking between songs, so I should probably say something like that. Or I heard some other worship leader say something and I thought that sounded really cool. And maybe you aren't thinking about that consciously, but I think it lies under your subconsciousness and kind of directs you. So instead of just thinking, okay, what do I need or what do I want to say, think about the question, what do people need to hear? Like, what do they need to hear to assure them that God still loves them, to lead them in worship? What do people need to hear to actually know what to do next in the service? Give some clear instructions, like, I want you to focus on this specific point in the next song. What do people need to hear? If we can frame that question, not what do I want to say, because then we're like, okay, I'm trying to impress people. But if we're just trying to tell people what they need to hear, which is truth from God, or direction in your service, it becomes so much clearer. And when you pair that with all of the other points that I just shared with you, and you prepare in advance and you memorize your talking points and you use the same language that you would use on stage that you use off stage, then it all comes together and you get to tell people authentically what they need to hear. And that's the best kind of speaking transition, when you can speak authentically, clearly, and lead people well. One bonus tip. I know I said this was going to be 5 tips, but here's a 6th one for you. And this is just to encourage you. Tip number 6 is to realize that sounding authentic takes time. There's a lot to learn whenever it comes to speaking between worship songs, and it's not going to happen overnight. So you're going to be focused on different things whenever you're first starting out. You might just be focused on getting through the speaking transition, and that's okay whenever you're first starting out. You've got 52 Sundays in a year to work on this. So don't try to think that you have to have it all 100% completely figured out the first time you do it. It's going to take time. The more you do it, as with anything in life, the more you do it, the more comfortable you'll feel. And then eventually you'll just be able to do it like you were talking to your friends out in the lobby after church. And that's when the authenticity comes in. So if you've only been speaking between worship songs for like 2 months, maybe even 6 months, and you're like, man, I just don't sound authentic, definitely utilize those other tips that I talk about. But also remember that it just takes time. And after a year of doing it, the repetition of doing it, you'll finally start to get it down. If you liked these tips, I want to share with you something that I put together. It's called 5 Tips to Instantly Improve Your Worship Leading. It's a free audio training. All you have to do is head down to the link in the description below. That'll take you to the website to sign up for it. And it's just 5 tips to instantly improve your worship leading. These are 5 pretty simple things that you just have to be aware of. And if you do them, they will instantly improve your worship leading, because you've just got to make the commitment to doing them. They don't take any time to learn how to do. You just got to know them and be able to make the commitment to doing them. So if you enjoyed this video, then check out that training, because that goes a little bit further in depth on some worship leading tips. Thanks so much for joining me. Once again, my name is Spencer Cormany from leadingworshipwell.com, and I put out weekly videos just like this. So if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead, hit subscribe down below, and also leave a like on this video, because whenever you leave a like on this video, it helps other worship leaders find videos just like this one, and it helps them be resourced to lead worship well. So once again, thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you in the next one. Keep leading worship well.